After roughly a week of wild statements and dark speculations about what the United States and the NATO powers might be preparing to do with respect to missile strikes against Russia, a decision has now been reached which essentially concedes Russia's red lines. Now, I appreciate that this is going to be controversial with some people, but in my opinion, that is clearly what has happened. Though I would say, again, that the way in which this concession has been made, acceptance perhaps is the more correct term, acknowledgement, if you prefer another word, the way in which the red lines have been acknowledged suggests that the West, at some point in the future, might just possibly come round to challenging them. But anyway, what has happened is what was signalled in the New York Times a day or so ago. The United States has authorized military counterstrikes, as they say, by Ukraine on Russian positions on Russian territory, but the area where these strikes will take place is going to be confined not just to the border regions, but apparently exclusively to the border regions around Kharkiv, opposite Kharkiv, in other words, around Belgorod and places like that. Now, there's been various statements to this effect from various US officials, but I'm going to go to one which supposedly was communicated by the State Department's spokesman to the Russian RIA Novosti news agency. And it says the following: the president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use US-supplied weapons for counter-fire purposes in the Kharkiv region so that Ukraine can hit back against Russian forces that are attacking them or preparing to attack them. Our policy with respect to prohibiting the use of ATACMS or long-range strikes inside of Russia has not changed. The last is the most important sentence here. Our policy with respect to prohibiting the use of ATACMS or long-range strikes inside of Russia has not changed. Now, to reiterate again, there's always been lots of discussion, speculation, claims, all sorts of extraordinary claims about what Russian red lines are. The Russians have made their red lines on this issue absolutely clear in multiple statements, including several made by Russian President Vladimir Putin, confirmed by him again in a further very tough statement which he made in a press conference a day or so ago in Tashkent. The Russian red line is against missile strikes, long-range missile strikes by US and Western missile systems on targets inside Russia. And when I say inside Russia, I mean inside what is uncontested Russian territory. In other words, Russia within its pre-2014 borders. Now, this statement says that that red line is acknowledged. Our policy with respect to prohibiting the use of ATACMS or long-range strikes inside of Russia has not changed. Now, we are told that this decision was actually made some time ago, and that, in fact, the discussions took place, according to the New York Times, roughly around the time when Secretary Blinken was actually in Kiev itself. We're going to turn to a further discussion of that very interesting meeting in Kiev, that very interesting visit in Kiev. We know by Blinken to Kiev. We now have an awful lot more information about it. But anyway, the New York Times is telling us that the discussions were made around that time, that in fact there'd already been a kind of agreement in principle to modify the policy in this way in order to allow the Ukrainians to launch counterstrikes, specifically in the Kharkiv region, where the Russians are conducting an offensive, and that this was done following discussions between the president and his inner core team, including Jake Sullivan and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and that on May 15th, Sullivan formally conveyed the policy recommendation to Biden. The president agreed, and now the decision has been announced. We are also told that the entire discussion took place within a very restricted format, though it seems that over the last couple of days, Christopher Cavalli, the US commander of NATO's joint forces in Europe, has also been now formally informed of the change of the position. Now, I'm going to say straight away that there's an awful lot about this latest article in the New York Times, which straightforwardly contradicts some of what we have been told before. We were told that what happened is that Secretary Blinken went to Kiev, that he had apparently a very fraught meeting there. We have now more information on quite how fraught that meeting was, that he came away from that meeting convinced that the policy needed to be changed in order to allow the Ukrainians to conduct strikes on Russia, and that he came back to the United States and made that recommendation to the White House, to the administration in general. And it was in fact that report about what Secretary Blinken was doing which then triggered the whole discussion and the whole uproar over the last few days, and which led to a sequence of Russian warnings. Now, there are some people who are saying that it's all been smoke and mirrors and that there's been a huge amount of misdirection here. But on this precise issue, on the issue of authorizing strikes into Russia, I really don't understand why. Why exactly there would have been misdirection about what Blinken actually said and did whilst he was in Kiev, and what the recommendation was that he brought with him back to the United States. There's also suggestions that the United States itself and NATO and all of the NATO member states have been informed of what was happening and were party to this misdirection as well, and that some of the statements that we have been hearing over the last couple of days suggesting that there had been some kind of a discussion within NATO about the decision to authorize strikes on Russia was misdirection as well. Again, I don't think this actually squares with some of the comments that various NATO officials, including Stoltenberg himself, and, by the way, the leaders of some European countries have been making. And quite why would you engage in misdirection like that and then tell us afterwards that basically the whole narrative that we've been hearing was untrue, and that the decision was the one that we just have received, which was to authorize counterstrikes specifically in the Kharkiv area. Here is what I think has actually been happening, was actually happening. I think that the United States did decide before Blinken went to Kiev that the Ukrainians ought to be given formal agreement to conduct counterstrikes against Russian forces in Kharkiv region. I suspect, and I'm sure that this is true, that the Ukrainians have indeed been asking, as all the various reports say, for permission to do precisely that for several days before even Blinken's visit. I don't think that was controversial. I think the United States was willing to do that. And moreover, I'm going to say something further. I think that the United States was agreeing to this modification in its policy, a modification in a policy, by the way, which in the narrow terms that we are discussing, in my opinion, does not even exist. I'll get to explain that in a moment. But anyway, I think that the United States never intended, the US government never intended to make this change, if it even was a change, public. But I suspect what happened is that Blinken arrived in Kiev. As we will see, he had a very, very difficult meeting with the Ukrainians there. It's clear that Zelensky was very unhappy with the entire events, the whole sequence of events that took place over the course of Blinken's visit. I think the Ukrainians did ask for permission to launch, or rather not for permission, for agreement by the United States for a total reversal of the policy, for an agreement by the United States to authorize deep strikes into Russia. I think that Blinken then came back to Washington with that Ukrainian demand. I think that the United States was embarrassed by that demand, especially as warnings were coming from Moscow, open warnings were coming from Moscow about the consequences of doing any such thing. But the United States did not want to appear to reject the request from the Ukrainians outright. So they made this announcement that they have just made, that the president is authorizing or is allowing the Ukrainians to use American weapons in counterfire operations in the Kharkiv area. Counterfire operations which will hit targets inside Russia. Now, I say that because, of course, what we're talking about, what has purportedly just been authorized, is something which, unquestionably, with the full knowledge and agreement of the United States, the Ukrainians have been doing, well, for well over a year. They have been shelling positions inside Russia. They've been shelling Belgorod regularly. They've been using a variety of weapons to do that. Some of those weapons undoubtedly have an American provenance. There have been M777 howitzers in the area as well, in this particular area, and as we will see in a moment, M109 Paladin self-propelled guns, and undoubtedly those have participated in some of these shelling strikes on Russian positions and indeed Russian towns and facilities in Ukraine. And of course, the Ukrainians have used various other Western supplied, or at least NATO supplied, weapon systems as well. For example, there have been numerous strikes on Belgorod using Czech built and supplied Vampir multiple launch rocket systems. This is something that has been going on continuously. And those of us who've been tracking the fighting in Kharkiv region along the Russian border have been fully aware of the fact that the Ukrainians, to the extent that they're able to conduct counter-battery fire at all, it is actually very difficult for them to do this in this area because the Russians have an overwhelming advantage. Anyway, to the extent that they've been doing it at all, they've shown no hesitation, no restraint at all in launching fire attacks on Russian positions inside Russia. And again, there's no reason to think that they have been avoiding using Western weapons, Western-supplied weapons, to do that. And by the way, the same applies a little further to the west, in Sumy region. In fact, it still applies there. There's so far been no Russian incursion into Sumy region, despite repeated predictions that one was coming. But the two sides have been engaging in artillery and drone attacks against each other along the border, and this has been ongoing now for some time, certainly before this supposed announcement of this change of policy was made. So I think that the United States has never really had a policy of preventing the Ukrainians from conducting artillery fire and rocket strikes across the border. But missile strikes, long-range missile strikes, is another matter. That, I think, the United States realizes is a Russian red line. The Russians have repeated it insistently over the last couple of days. The United States is not so far prepared to go behind that red line, to cross that red line. They understand that if they did, the crisis would escalate and escalate out of control. Now, I don't believe these American moves were coordinated with the Europeans. And the reason I say that is because the Europeans have been, those who advocate missile strikes against Russia have been singing an entirely different song. For example, in advance of the NATO meeting of foreign ministers, which has just taken place, the Czech foreign minister made a wild demand in which he said that the best way to prevent Russian missile strikes on Ukrainian cities was to shoot down the aircraft that participated in those strikes, those Russian aircraft which participated in those strikes, and to do so over Russian territory. So that would have meant using long-range surface-to-air missiles or potentially airborne missiles launched from F-16 fighters to shoot down Russian bombers operating from well inside Russia. It's a fantastic idea. The missiles the F-16 carries would not have the range to reach the Russian bombers taking off from the big strategic air bases the Russians operate in places like Engels, for example. And if the F-16s came anywhere close to the Russian border in order to do that, or indeed crossed the border in order to do that, the Russians would very rapidly shoot them down. The alternative, presumably, would be to use surface-to-air missiles to try and shoot these Russian bombers down. But again, positioning surface-to-air missiles close to the Russian border would only guarantee their rapid destruction. And besides, again, surface-to-air missiles like the Patriot do not have the range to intercept Russian bombers operating from far inside Russia. This idea that the Czech foreign minister was floating is actually an absurd one. However, in saying that, I've no reason to doubt that he believed that the United States, the mighty United States, does possess these capabilities. One of the underlying stories of this crisis is the still almost universal belief that exists to a great extent in many places around the world, and certainly in Eastern Europe, that the United States still has an almost unlimited reach and that its weapons can do whatever it is that the United States wants them to do. It's very much a belief, I think, that some Ukrainian political leaders, including, by the way, Zelensky himself, still have, and it explains the difficult relationship that Zelensky apparently has with US officials, and, by the way, President Biden himself, because he can't quite bring himself to understand that there are, in fact, positive limits to what the United States can do. Anyway, a fantastic plan from the Czech foreign minister, but of course he floated that possibility because he presumably thought that this was something that the United States might be able to do or might be willing to authorize, and that this is what the whole discussion, in effect, was all about. Using American weapons to conduct deep strikes inside Russia, in this case, surface-to-air missile strikes or long-range airborne missile strikes targeting Russian aircraft. And the Czech foreign minister wasn't the only person to talk in this fantastical way. Another party was the Danish foreign minister. He also spoke about the possibility of F-16 fighter jets, those supplied from Denmark, crossing the Russian border. He seemed to have no qualms about that. Again, the fact that those F-16s would almost immediately be shot down if they did cross the Russian border apparently wasn't something he understood or considered. But anyway, apparently he thought that this is what the discussion was going to be all about. And I think most embarrassing of all, we had President Macron of France. Now, he did have clearly some knowledge of the discussions that were taking place in Washington, but he clearly didn't understand fully what the Americans were going to say, because he was waving some kind of map, or rather, over the course of this press conference, which, to be frank, I couldn't myself clearly see. But he also spoke about attacks on Russian military facilities from which missile strikes against Ukraine were being launched. And clearly that is what he was agitating for. And once more, if you're going to attack those bases from which the Russian aircraft that launched the missiles against Ukraine are located, well, you're not going to just confine yourself to military strikes along the Kharkiv border. You're going to have to launch missile strikes deep into Russia as well. So it seems to me that all of these Western leaders, European leaders, were unsure of what exactly it was that the Americans were discussing. Some of them, perhaps, were given a clue. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, even as he reiterates that Germany is not going to supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine, did over the course of that press conference with Macron, concede that the Ukrainians should be allowed to launch, to engage in counterstrikes against the Russians from where the Russians were attacking them. But then it's become clear that he too was talking about the border area as well, and the Germans have now made it clear that they mean the Kharkiv border area also. So there we are. It seems to me that the Americans kept this whole discussion fairly tightly to themselves. They probably had some conversations with some key allies, the British, who have remained remarkably quiet over the course of this whole affair, the Germans, to some extent the French, though Macron either misunderstood what the Americans were saying, or perhaps he tried to get them to go further than they were, in fact, prepared to go. And others, like the Italians, who remain adamantly opposed to weapon systems, Western weapon systems, being used in any part of Russia at all, well, clearly they were kept completely out of the loop. So there it is. This is my reconstruction of what has happened. To reiterate again, we have had a modification of a policy which in practical terms has not existed. Of course, the United States has given the impression in the past that it has given a blanket prohibition against the use of American-supplied weapons by Ukraine to carry out any attacks on Russian territory at all. But the reality is that those attacks have repeatedly taken place, and the United States has not in any way shown any concern about them. The Russian Foreign Ministry has been making precisely this very same point. The Foreign Ministry spokesman, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, when discussing the use by the West, by the Ukrainians of Western-supplied weapons to hit at Russian territory, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, said the following: "This is precisely what Russia has been saying all along. It was obvious that the NATO members were lying, putting up a smoke screen and making up stories that they allegedly had not yet decided whether or not to allow the Kiev regime to carry out strikes with Western weapons on Russian territory." It's classic NATO-style manipulation. The policy might have seemed to be one of forbidding Ukraine from using NATO weapons to strike at targets in Russia, but that policy, to all intents and purposes, never existed at all. The policy to prohibit long-range missile strikes on Russian targets, where the Russians, in other words, have set out clearly their red line, that, of course, that policy does actually exist. And for the moment, at least, it is being respected. Well, I said that this whole incident has arisen and reflects the very bad relationship that now exists between the United States, or at least the US leadership, and the leadership of Ukraine. It is clear that the Ukrainians are becoming increasingly desperate about the situation on the battlefronts, and indeed generally. They're seeing the diplomatic initiative that they apparently invested massive, disproportionate hopes on, which is the peace conference in Switzerland. They see that process now turn to dust. They're furious about the fact that Biden is not going to attend that conference. They are deeply, deeply dismayed that the Chinese leadership has decided that he won't attend the conference either. And apparently they made very clear to Blinken over the course of his visit their extreme dissatisfaction and worry about the general situation. And we've had confirmation of all of this in a long article in the Financial Times. Now, the article purportedly is about a security agreement which Ukraine and the United States are said to be in the process of agreeing with each other. The security agreement is like all of the other security agreements that Ukraine has initialed with various Western countries, not worth the paper is written on, since by definition it can only come into effect after the war is ended, and the war shows no sign of ending, and Ukraine is losing. But the United States has obviously agreed to move forward with this security agreement, as much in order to try to keep the Ukrainians calm as for any other reason. And we've had a long confirmation of all of this in a lengthy article, which has clearly been officially authorized, which has appeared in the United States, in the Financial Times. And the title of this article, in fact, gives the whole game away. US opt to offer Ukraine security pact as tensions rise between allies. Agreement next month aims to placate Kiev officials who fear relationship with Washington has hit a low. So the security agreement, and I would suggest the announcement that we had late yesterday, early this morning, about authorizing Ukraine to launch artillery strikes on positions in Kharkiv region, Russian positions, well, on the border close to Kharkiv region. Well, I suggest that all of this is precisely this. It's intended principally to assuage, to placate the Ukrainians. And we could go on to read this. The US is close to signing a new bilateral security pact with Ukraine in a signal of support, aiming to assuage Kiev after tense relations that some Ukrainian officials say have hit their lowest ebb since Russia's full-scale invasion. We then go on to hear that Volodymyr Zelensky's frustration with Joe Biden was laid bare this week when the Ukrainian president, rebuked his US counterpart in unusually blunt terms, saying Biden's plan to attend a Democratic fundraiser rather than Ukraine's peace summit on June 15-16 was not a strong decision. One Zelensky-appointed senior government official who spoke to the Financial Times about the US-Ukraine relationship said, "We are farther apart than ever since the war started. It is very, very tense." And we then go on to read that the pact has been negotiated, the security pact has been negotiated during weeks of increasingly strained relations between Kiev and Washington, Zelensky's office this week issued a memo to officials and MPs, Ukrainian MPs, seen by the Financial Times, that instructs them to criticize both Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping for not attending the summit. If they don't attend, then what is their real interest? The memo wrote. And the Financial Times goes on to say several Ukrainian officials said that Kiev's bitterness over lack of top-level US support for its peace summit initiative was just one of many points of friction with Washington and other Western partners that have erupted at a particularly difficult time for Ukraine's leadership. More than a dozen current and former Ukrainian officials, more than a dozen current and former Ukrainian officials, and G7 diplomats in Kiev. In other words, this has been a massive authorized leak to the Financial Times, who spoke to the Financial Times, point to a clutch of contentious issues. And then we're told about the 6-month delay in Congress approving military assistance, the fact that there is not going to be any progress in Ukraine's membership bid for NATO at the Washington summit in July, the Biden administration's prohibition on Kiev's use of American-supplied weapons inside Russia. Notice this isn't specifically about the Kharkiv border. It's stated the Biden administration's prohibition on Kiev's use of American-supplied weapons inside Russia and Ukraine's drone strikes on Russian oil refineries. We're then told that Ukrainian attacks on 2 radar systems that form part of Moscow's nuclear warning system over the past week have been a particular point of conflict with Washington, which is worried that it may provoke Moscow and further escalate the war. Other points of concern relate to diverging strategies on how Ukraine can achieve victory and what that victory might look like. A clear hint that some people in the administration are floating the option of seeking a freeze of the conflict rather than continuing to endorse Ukraine's maximalist demands for a complete withdrawal of the Russian forces from all Ukrainian territory. And then we go on to read, as well as Zelensky's little explained removal of top government and military officials the United States had worked closely with. And then we go on to read that there has been a purge in Kiev of officials who were seen as being too close to the United States. Several Ukrainian government officials and diplomats from G7 nations cited the firing of Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny in February and Infrastructure Minister Alexander Kubrakov this month. Both men were well respected and enjoyed close working relationships with US and EU officials. The officials told the FT the G7 ambassadors have warned Zelensky's government about what they see as disruptive and inexplicable moves. And in fact, the Russian media has been reporting that Ukraine's purge of officials who are seen as being too close to the United States is far more extensive than the Financial Times is saying, and that it includes officials who were trying to press home US complaints about corruption inside Ukraine. In fact, Blinken supposedly came to Kiev, in part bringing up again the topic of corruption in Zelensky's circle. Zelensky apparently was extremely angry, and he has retaliated, this is according to the Russian media, with sackings of officials who are seen as being too close to the United States. And the Financial Times hints at American displeasure by talking about the sacking of officials who are seen as disruptive. Sackings of officials, an action seen as disruptive and inexplicable. And then we're told that the fraying relations and discord come as Ukrainian forces struggle to hold their defensive lines against a bigger and better armed Russian army in the east, and whilst Zelensky's under huge pressure to mobilize more men and to take other unpopular decisions to bolster the war effort. We then go on to read that nonetheless, despite all that we just heard, relations were not really that bad. They still managed to get on fairly well, and that the demand from Ukraine for permission to strike inside Russia was a relatively recent demand, coming 3 weeks ago when Russian forces opened a new front in the northeastern Kharkiv region. But then we go on to hear, and this is from a Ukrainian official, a second senior Ukrainian official, said Zelensky has grown more emotional and nervous over the situation on the battlefield and what they say he sees as Washington's eagerness to start negotiations with Russia, despite the White House stating in public that it is entirely a decision for Kiev to initiate such talks. Zelensky thinks they want the war to go away before the election, the official said. He added that the Ukrainian president was also unhappy with the Biden administration's insistence that Kiev not hit Russian oil infrastructure over fear of raising global gas prices in an election year. A third senior Ukrainian official, notice these are officials, these are not former officials, these are actual members of the Ukrainian government. Anyway, a third senior Ukrainian official used the word paranoia to describe the feeling inside Zelensky's office in recent months, as Zelensky and his team have worked to prepare for next month's peace summit. The official said Zelensky has deep anxiety about the military situation, but especially about the peace summit in June. And we then read about how Zelensky is deeply unhappy about the fact that the peace summit is not proceeding in the way that he wants, and that he's criticized the lack of response of the Biden administration during a visit to Brussels on Tuesday. And he's quoted as saying, "I'm aware that America supports the summit, but we are not aware on which level." And anyway, we then finally read that several members of Zelensky's government say they're beginning to worry about the methods employed by their president, in other words, by Zelensky, to communicate with the United States. One said that Zelensky was very irritated with Biden, adding they were concerned about openly provoking the White House. "What do you say in America?" a fourth Ukrainian government official asked the FT. "Do not bite the hand that feeds you." So, it looks as if the Americans and some of the top people in Ukraine think that Zelensky is panicking and losing his mind. He's demanding permission to launch military strikes across Russia. He's demanding permission to attack Russian oil refineries, the Russian energy system. He believes that the United States wants to negotiate a freeze of the conflict and to do that before the presidential election in November, something which he has completely set his heart against. He, in other words, no longer trusts Biden, or it seems many of the people around him, and he is behaving in an increasingly erratic and emotional way. And he has clearly also attached utterly disproportionate, indeed ridiculous hopes on this peace conference in Switzerland. He seems to have persuaded himself that it would lead to some sort of diplomatic breakthrough. It's difficult to understand why. Anyway, he's come to that belief, and he's badgering the Americans about it all the time, and he's also badgering the Chinese as well. And the Americans are clearly finding him increasingly difficult to manage, and some people of his own team and of the within the Ukrainian government are beginning to get worried about Zelensky as well. And the Americans, faced by all of this, but fully aware of what the Russian red lines are trying to find ways to calm Zelensky down. And amongst them, they have come up with this idea of a security pact, a meaningless piece of paper, which the Financial Times straightforwardly admits is intended to placate the Ukrainians, in other words, to placate Zelensky himself. And they've also come up with this latest announcement that no, Ukraine is still prohibited from engaging in deep strikes against Russia. That's not what the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and the Taurus missiles are for. The Taurus missiles, if they're ever supplied to Ukraine. But obviously he can continue to do, the Ukrainians can continue to do that which they have always been doing, which is to shell Russian positions in Russia itself in connection with the ongoing fighting along the border. This is an appalling situation. I should say, by the way, that in an earlier version of this article in the Financial Times, I get the sense that it has been edited in places. But in an earlier article in the Financial version of this article, I also read that Zelensky was extremely unhappy with the way that Blinken conducted himself whilst he was in Kiev, and that Zelensky was absolutely furious over Blinken's performance with a guitar in the cafe in Kiev. That didn't go down well with Zelensky at all. I said at the time that I thought that was a bizarre thing for Blinken to have done. Well, as I said, an earlier version of the article appeared to, well, basically confirmed as much. So there it is. I've been saying for weeks that there is a growing atmosphere of panic in the West and in Kiev, and the Financial Times has provided confirmation of this, and we see this in this latest drama that we've had over the missile strikes deep inside Russia. In fact, there has been an awful lot that's been going on over the last couple of days that is of a highly performative nature. In itself, it makes almost no sense. Firstly, we've had obviously this decision about authorizing Ukraine to do what it has been doing with American permission for many months, indeed more than a year now. But which is shell Russian positions inside Russia. But we've had other strange decisions as well. We've had decisions, for example, this strange Swedish decision to provide Ukraine with Sweden's only 2 AWACS aircraft. Now, I've had 2 incredibly helpful emails about this very topic from, I should say, former military people, Western military people. I am not going to say more about them. But anyway, both are familiar, or at least have knowledge of this system, certainly more in-depth knowledge than I do. Both of them say that it is indeed in some ways very potent and sophisticated system, but that it is inconceivable that the Ukrainians could simply, board these aircraft and operate a system like this without many long months of preparation and training. Both of them basically say that it is inconceivable that these AWACS aircraft could operate in Ukrainian airspace. If they did, they would be shot down by the Russians very fast. They're ungainly, bulky machines, aircraft, turboprop aircraft. One of these commentators has said that the radar, if it were working, would inevitably provide emissions which would also alert the Russians to its presence. Both commentators, both correspondents, therefore, appear to think that these aircraft will operate from within NATO airspace, almost certainly with their Swedish crews. I think this is absolutely right, but given that the Western powers are already supplying Ukraine with a huge amount of information from NATO's own AWACS systems, this move simply duplicates a capability that already exists. In fact, it doesn't duplicate it because I suspect that American AWACS systems are actually more powerful than this Swedish one, advanced though this Swedish one does appear to be. So what is the purpose of all of this? Well, one of the commentators has suggested, one of the correspondents has suggested that it might be to provide cover for further information that the NATO countries, through their far more powerful AWACS systems, are already providing. Well, that may be the case. It could be that it is exactly like that. But I have to say, it looks to me again as if this is all a piece of theatre intended to give the Ukrainians some encouragement that they're not being abandoned, that advanced equipment is being provided to them, even if in reality they can't use it. I mean, that, it seems to me, is what this is mostly about. As I said, calming the increasingly hysterical mood in Kiev, specifically on the part of Zelensky himself, seems to me to be what much of this now is all about. And, well, we've also had this strange business of Macron talking again about providing instructors to the Ukrainians, French instructors, so trainers. So Macron, over the last few weeks, as we all know, has been talking about sending French troops to Ukraine. This idea has met with almost universal opposition across the major powers within NATO. Nonetheless, Macron at various times has persisted with it. Then a couple of days ago, out of nowhere, his defense minister, Mr. Lecornu, according to the Ukrainians, had agreed with General Syrskyi, the Ukrainian military commander, overall military commander, that France would be sending trainers, we're not told how many, to Ukraine to help train Ukrainian troops there. And the Ukrainians announced that decision, and then almost immediately the French contradicted it. They said that no such agreement had so far been reached. Then, shortly after, we hear that an agreement of that kind has indeed been made, and that it's most likely going to be announced when Zelensky travels to Paris in a short time. Again, I wonder whether the Ukrainians, perhaps hoping for the arrival of French troops, their hopes raised by Macron, tried to bounce the French into agreeing to something that the French were not yet ready for, but have presumably been considering, and whether this has caused some annoyance in Paris, and then has led to these contradictory announcements and messages. Whatever, the key thing is Zelensky is panicking. I've been suggesting this for some time. A short time ago, a couple of days ago, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, said that there had been a meeting between Zelensky and Western diplomats in Kiev at the end of April, and Zelensky apparently lost all self-control and in front of the diplomats gave way to some kind of public tantrum. I said that this had been said by the Russians, and we couldn't place an excessive amount of reliance upon it, but nonetheless, it did seem consistent with what we have been hearing. And then, of course, there were also reports appearing in the Western media, in the American media, I believe it was, that over the course of the Kharkiv operation, Zelensky was screaming at his generals, convinced that he was not being told the truth about the situation in Kharkiv region. Well, final confirmation of Zelensky's true state of mind, of the extent to which he is no longer in full control of himself, has now been provided by the Financial Times. And ominously for him, we're being told that people within the Ukrainian government are becoming concerned at the way he is conducting himself with the Americans. Do not bite the hand that feeds you. And the result of all of this has been a crisis with the Russians, which has enabled the Russians to repeat and reinforce their red lines. And they're still doing this. So, for example, we've had statements now from Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council. He's now come out and said all their military equipment and specialists fighting against us, this is Western military equipment and specialists fighting against us, will be destroyed, both on the territory of former Ukraine, notice he says former Ukraine, and on the territory of other countries, should strikes be carried out from there against Russian territory. So that was Medvedev. The Russians have also made further comments. Another Russian official, apparently an MP, has come out and said that the Russians now, even in response to this public admission from the West that Ukraine is conducting attacks, strikes on Russian territory with Western weapons, that Russia now reserves to itself the right to undertake asymmetric responses, which is to say that the Russians might actually assist in all kinds of missions and sabotage missions, strikes against Western targets now in other places in the world. So, a disastrous situation at the political center in Kiev. Western governments clearly have no real answer as to how to deal with Zelensky's meltdown, which is clearly what is now taking place. As I said, we've had confirmation of it, final, conclusive confirmation of it from the Financial Times. And in the meantime, this peace conference, which Zelensky has been placing all his hopes on, probably in no small part because he is visibly having a meltdown, Western leaders, or rather global leaders, are choosing to stay away. It still seems as if President Biden has finally resolved that he is not going. The Chinese government has also announced that they will not be attending this meeting in any form. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman made that clear Mao Ning made that clear over a press conference in the Chinese Foreign Ministry earlier today. The Chinese Foreign Ministry readout reads as follows, and this is Mao Ning's words: China attaches great importance to Switzerland organizing the first summit on peace in Ukraine and has been in close communication with Switzerland and relevant parties on this since early this year. China always maintains that the International Peace Conference needs to meet the three important elements of recognition from both Russia and Ukraine, equal participation of all parties, and fair discussion of all peace plans. Otherwise, the peace conference can hardly play a substantive role for restoring peace. These elements proposed by China are fair, legitimate, and do not target any party. They are written into the Common Understanding on Political Settlement of the Ukraine Crisis, jointly issued by China and Brazil recently, and reflect the universal concern of the international community, especially the vast developing countries. Based on what we have heard from various parties and the released arrangement for the meeting, it doesn't seem that the three elements proposed by China will be met. There is an apparent gap between the meeting's arrangement and what China stands for, as well as the universal expectation in the international community. In this case, China is hardly able to take part in the meeting and has informed relevant parties of our consideration and concerns. We will continue to promote talks for peace in our own way, maintain communication with all parties, and jointly accumulate conditions for the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Zelensky apparently is now on his way to Saudi Arabia, trying to plead with MBS to attend this meeting, though quite why he believes that if MBS chooses to go, that will persuade others escapes me. But clearly, as I said, Zelensky is no longer in full control of himself, and people who are in that sort of condition are no longer seeing things entirely clearly, or as they really are. Well, Zelensky's term, of course, has ended. one of the co-authors of Ukraine's constitution, has apparently come forward and told RIA Novosti he's in exile in Ukraine, so he's a political opponent of but he's in exile in Moscow, I should say. So he's clearly an opponent of President Zelensky's. But anyway, he says that the terms of the constitution are quite clear. Zelensky's term has ended. He is not legitimately the president of Ukraine anymore. Supposedly, the secondary law that Zelensky is relying upon, and which Putin discussed at length in Uzbekistan, that secondary law has no bearing because the Constitutional Court of Ukraine has previously ruled that the Constitution of Ukraine cannot be interpreted or affected by the passage of secondary laws. I don't know whether this analysis is correct. All I would say is that the fact that there are questions about the legitimacy of his position, I suspect, is another factor which is making Zelensky increasingly nervous. Well, this has been a long program discussing all these various complicated moves, but it would not be complete if I did not say something more about the general military situation. And it continues to develop catastrophically for Ukraine. There was much talk over the last couple of days about the Ukraine launching successful counterattacks in the Kharkiv region. The Germans have apparently now authorized Ukraine to use the M270 multiple launch rocket systems that Germany has supplied to Ukraine to conduct strikes against Russian territory in the Kharkiv border regions where the fighting is going on. Every day I read of endless numbers, seemingly endless numbers of Ukrainian rocket and artillery systems deployed to precisely this area that the Russians are destroying, either through counter-battery work, in other words, through shelling or bombing, or with their terrifyingly effective Lancet drones. I am sure that if the Ukrainians are foolish enough to deploy this M270 system to the border area, the Russians will destroy it very quickly. In the meantime, the Ukrainian counterattacks that we've been hearing so much about in this area appear to have failed. The very latest report is that the Russians have now broken into the fortified area, the remaining fortified area in northern Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, where the Ukrainians have been trying to hold their positions and where they are in effect surrounded. It looks like Ukrainian resistance in this area of Volchansk is collapsing. It is the larger part of Volchansk. If it collapses there, there's every reason to think that the Russians will be able to advance further south of the Volcha River, which they have apparently already crossed and established bridgeheads across in various places, and rapidly capture the remainder of Volchansk. So, one very bad piece of news for Ukraine. The Kharkiv offensive looks like it's restarting again, at least in earnest, with the situation in Volchansk deteriorating. There's not been so much news, at least not news that I've seen, over the situation in Chasiv Yar, but there was a report that the Russians are indeed advancing in the northern flanks of Chasiv Yar, that they're gaining more ground, that they are indeed now fighting in Kalininka, the village to the northwest of Chasiv Yar, and that they're approaching the aqueduct there. They're apparently in the process of storming more villages in the Kupiansk area. In the Ocheretino, Avdeevka area, it seems that they're now progressing. They're now making significant progress in capturing Novomikhailivka, northwest of Ocheretino, the fall of which would put them in a strong position to intercept and finally cut the vital highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, the town close to Chasiv Yar, further east, causing major disruption to Ukrainian supply lines. They're making major advances, apparently, in the area of Netailevo. They're apparently outflanking the Ukrainian forces that are trying to hold out in the next village to the west, Karlovka. They're advancing to the north and to the south of Karlovka. There is a water reservoir in the area, but the Russians appear to be advancing along both banks of that particular reservoir. And in Krasnogorovka, the Russians have now captured the city council building. Apparently, they've raised their flag there. I haven't seen the film, but apparently there is film of Russian troops storming this building. And one way or the other, it seems that the Russians are now reactivating their advance in Krasnogorovka, and it's likely that that place, as I said, is going to fall fairly soon. So everywhere along the front lines, the Russians are continuing their advances. In fact, it's been suggested that the momentum is again accelerating, including in Kharkiv region, that the Russians, having come up against Ukrainian resistance in Kharkiv region, are now able to go back on the advance again, having repelled Ukrainian counterattacks and inflicted heavy losses on the Ukrainian troops. And there are more and more reports right across all of the front lines of more and more Ukrainian troops surrendering in various places. Lastly, I ought to say that there are also now reports that when Ukrainian brigades are reinforced, do receive reinforcements, they take the form of battalions or units of recently mobilized and almost entirely untrained men who are incapable of resisting the Russians or fighting the Russians successfully on the battlefields. The key takeaway of the events of the last 24 hours is, as I said, that there is a meltdown in Kiev, that President Zelensky is in the course of, well, if one reads the Financial Times article and puts it together with all the various other things that have been said and written over the last couple of weeks, that he appears to be, well, it would almost give the impression that he's in the throes of a slow-motion nervous breakdown. That might be putting it too strongly, but anyway, the Financial Times has given us a fairly strong clue about what is actually going on. And the catastrophic situation on the front lines shows us why he might be behaving and acting in this kind of way. The breakdown is entirely easy to understand. Anyway, there is a lot more to say, but I'm going to finish this particular program at this point. To continue further, would already make this long video inordinately long. In my video tomorrow, I'm going to discuss some enormously interesting and very helpful information I've been provided by an invaluable source explaining the reason for the attacks on the radar stations, the Russian radar station at Armavir, and one which, in my opinion, explains the attack and which links it to the failure so far of the attackers' system, something which I notice even Military Watch magazine, one of these many American magazines that discuss military matters, they're tiptoeing now towards acknowledging as well. So that, as I said, I hope to return to tomorrow. But anyway, this is where I finish today's program. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also check our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you if you like this video, please remember you can tick the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.